Hey, how's it going, guys? It's Technical Tim here, and I want to thank everyone so much who's been liking all my videos and subscribing to the channel, and I'd really appreciate it if you gave this video a thumbs up, or subscribe if you haven't already. And I'm just going to do a quick little discussion on with the Usman and Covington fight coming up. There's a lot of talk about their wrestling, how it will match up. I've talked about the fight already in another video, so go check that one out, so I'm not going to really talk about how it mixes up. Or how it matches up, but I'm going to talk about just the wrestling backgrounds of these guys, because I tweeted out a little bit about it yesterday on Twitter, so you can see some of those tweets, and I'll kind of be referencing those in this video. But just I know I have some guys who are from Europe and stuff who won't know as much about American wrestling over here, and then I know I just have people who don't follow wrestling as much, so I can kind of explain what's going on with these two, because you always hear the D2 versus D1 and things like that. But essentially with wrestling, there is 3 different styles of wrestling. There is Greco-Roman, which is all upper body wrestling where you can't touch below the waist. So I think that's kind of a limited form of wrestling, because I mean, if you can't shoot double legs and things like that, it's just not real wrestling. It's almost like boxing versus kickboxing. It's like you're boxing and you can't use kicks. It's kind of like a limited form of wrestling. So yeah, there's Greco-Roman wrestling, and then there's freestyle wrestling, and this is also in the Olympics. So freestyle and Greco are the 2 styles that are in the Olympics. And then freestyle, this is like what Jordan Burroughs does, and essentially, this is kind of the international style of wrestling, and this is more of what you kind of see in MMA, where there's a lot of takedowns, you see double legs, you can touch below the waist, so it's different from Greco in that regard. Different rules, obviously, than Greco. I'm not going to go into the rules. But with freestyle, they don't hold a huge emphasis on holding people down. Like, you have a limited time to be able to you have a limited time to be able to expose your opponent's back if you get a takedown, but then they'll stand you back up. And so freestyle is very emphasized on getting takedowns. So that's good for MMA. It makes you a good takedown artist. So whenever you think of, I'll use examples. When you think of Greco-Roman guys, I think Kudalaba is a Greco-Roman guy. Freestyle guys, you can think of Jordan Burroughs, although he did the other form of wrestling that I'm going to be talking about in a second. Yoel Romero, guys like that. They were freestyle guys. And then you have folk style, and this is only in America. And what this is, it's very similar to freestyle in ways where you can go below the waist, so there's double legs, there's singles, pretty much anything goes as far as takedowns goes. So there's obviously a huge emphasis on takedowns, but there's also an emphasis on holding people down. And that's why I like folk style wrestling so much, because in MMA, not only does it teach to be able to take people down, it also teaches to be able to hold someone down, because holding someone down is just as, if more important than taking someone down. And what folk style wrestling, so essentially this is whenever there's folk style wrestling in America, it's your youth wrestling and then high school wrestling. Anytime you see high school teams wrestling, they're doing folk style. And then in college, so whenever you see D1, like NCAA Division 1, NCAA Division 2, NCAA, NAIA, any junior college national championships, all those college matches are folk style. So those guys are trying to get takedowns, they're trying to hold each other down, they're trying to pin each other, things like that. So what happens is, with a lot of Americans, folk style is usually the first style you learn. And so I started wrestling when I was 4, and I did a ton of folk style. And if you name an American wrestler, Daniel Cormier, Josh Koscheck, guys who fought in the UFC, they're all American, and they all started in folk style. So they're very, and so usually you'll see a lot of good Americans who are good at getting takedowns and holding people down, where some of the European guys can maybe get takedowns, but they're not as good with the wrestling rides of keeping people down. So yeah, So, but you'll have a lot of people in America, they start off in folk style, and then they'll do it in like high school or grade school. And then their summers, they'll do greco and freestyle. And generally, Americans transfer to freestyle very, very well because it's similar, because they're already good at takedowns, and freestyle is very takedown emphasized, so that they can transfer over to that really well. But Americans generally suck at Greco-Roman wrestling, and you can see in the Olympics and in the World Championships, Americans never do well because we don't practice that as much. But that's generally, if you start wrestling, some people just do folk style in America. But if you're serious about it, like I was, my parents got me into freestyle and greco during the summers, and then I did folk style during the school year. And so what I'm trying to I'm just trying to give you kind of the overall background of that so you kind of know. And then if you go and try to make the Olympics after D1, like after your college years, so I don't know, like a Daniel Cormier, he wrestled in college, that was all folk style. When he goes for the Olympics, he then goes into freestyle. Most of those guys then transfer into freestyle because freestyle is more similar to folk style. And so these two, though, Kamaru Usman and Colby Covington, this is their overall wrestling background. So Colby started kind of similar to your average American wrestler who starts at a young age. He started at whenever he was like 4 years old, and he must have been doing folk style, and then he probably did a little bit of freestyle and greco. I'm assuming in his childhood, I don't know that for sure, but I'm assuming he did because he was a high-level wrestler. And then what happened with him is he was a state champ in high school, and then in college he didn't have the grades. He could have definitely went to what we call Division I. He could have easily went to a Division I school, but he didn't have the grades. And so sometimes whenever you don't have the grades, you'll kind of get sent to some powerhouse. If you're like a top recruit like Colby was out of high school, you'll get sent to like a powerhouse like JUCO college. And I think it's Iowa Central, which is the same school John Jones went to, and a lot of just high-level wrestlers who didn't have the grades. And I think they were roommates even. I think they were there at the same time. But, yeah, Colby went to Iowa Central Community College, and that's JUCO. And so when he was a freshman, Colby, he won the JUCO National Championships. And then usually whenever you go to a JUCO school and you don't have the grades, a D1 school will try to like recruit you later if you got your grades up in college. And so then Colby went over to the University of Iowa Hawkeyes, which is a D1 school. And I mean, this is like essentially the New York Yankees or the New England Patriots of college wrestling. They have... I mean, I think they have to have the most D1 national titles, and they're just a fucking powerhouse. And Dan Gable, one of the best wrestlers of all time, at least in America, college, he wrestled there and was the coach there for a while. And Colby was there his sophomore year, but he couldn't really get a starting roster spot. And that's not like an insult to him. It's just whenever you're at Iowa and you're at that school, to make a roster spot, like you have to basically beat guys who were all-American level because they have such a stacked team. So he couldn't really, he would get some starting spots and everything, but he just couldn't really make that team. And then he went to Oregon State, and he kind of became like their big wrestler because Oregon State's not really that great at wrestling, and the Pac-12 over in the West Coast, they're just not that good of a D1 wrestling conference. The best D1 wrestling conference is the Big Ten, where you got your Iowas and you got your Penn States. You got some really, really good teams over there. But then whenever he was a junior, he started wrestling D1, and he was a junior, and he did an All-American. And what an All-American means in D1 is finishing top 8 in your weight division. And so in 2010, he wrestled at 174 pounds, and he was one match away from All-Americaning. So anytime you hear an All-American, like an All-American wrestler, it means they medaled at nationals, and technically you're an All-American if you medal in Division II nationals as well. But if you're a D1 All-American, that means you took top 8 at the NCAA Division I championships. And Colby failed to do that in 2010, his junior year. But then in his senior year, in 2011, he was always ranked around like number 5 to 7. And I think he was seeded 4th going into the tournament, and he ended up taking 5th. And he like had some tough matches. Like, I feel like if he just happened to wrestle a really good tournament, he was probably capable of winning. He just had like a lot of wrestlers in that way. Like, he had John Reeder, he had other guys. He just had a lot of guys in that year who were probably just very similar in skill level. So he would have had to win just a lot of close matches to pull it off. But he took 5th. So that's very respectful. And so he's a solid D1 level type of wrestler. And so Kamaru Usman, you'll always hear D1's way better than D2. But the thing about Kamaru Usman is he's a very different type of D2 wrestler just because of when he started wrestling. And as a general rule, Division I's absolutely better than Division II, but then you can get outliers. And there was a heavyweight recently who was the best freestyle wrestler in America, and he came from Division II, and he could beat all the Division I guys. And this is like what's interesting about Kamaru Usman is he started wrestling usually, like, if you're a killer wrestler, you usually start whenever you're like 4 to 8 years old. And Kamaru started in, he was born in 1987. He started when he was 15 in 2002 to 2003, in that range, as a sophomore in high school, which is fucking absurd. Like, he started when he was a teenager, and usually, like, he would have just been too far behind to catch up to any of these other guys. And so he ended up winning state as a senior, and he went 53-3, which is awesome. Like, I mean, winning a state title your 3rd year into wrestling is absolutely bananas. It just means you're a freak athlete, and you can even be a good athlete and not be a good wrestler, because some of the athletic needs as a wrestler, like balance, understanding of leverage, things like that, don't always translate to other athletes. Like, I remember when I was in high school, we would bring in football players and some of the more athletic kids at our school, and they would wrestle for a few years and they just couldn't pick up on it. They couldn't catch up to guys who had been wrestling from a younger age. But Kamaru was able to do that. And so he won state as a senior, and he went to an NAIA school, which is kind of a lower tier college school. And I'm sure he couldn't get no Division I school probably really wanted him at that time, because he was such an inexperienced kid. Like, he had only been wrestling for a few years. So why would a school try to recruit someone like that? You'd rather recruit a Covington who's been wrestling his whole life, because you don't want to, you want a decent finished product. You don't want a finished product, but you want a well-polished wrestler, and you don't want to be developing their skills like from the start, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So he went to NAIA, and then he made the tournament and didn't even All-American, because he just wasn't at that level yet. Like, he's wrestling guys who had just been wrestling for far too long, and he just wasn't there yet. But he kept improving in college, and he ended up winning the national tournament, the D2 national tournament, as a senior in 2010, which is fucking insane. That means he won the D2 tournament after 7 years of experience of wrestling, which is just, I can't describe how impressive that is. That means he was just picking up on it, because the fact that he didn't even All-American in NAIA a couple years before that means he just made drastic improvements throughout his college career, and so he was still playing catch-up. So, whenever they're about the same age, Kamaru and Colby, if they had wrestled in like 2007 or 2008, their early college years, Colby would have absolutely beat Kamaru. But later in their careers, I think it would have been very close. And so this is when the story gets a little more interesting with Kamaru Usman. So he ended up winning the D2 tournament, and then he tried to make the transition into freestyle, and that's what we hear a lot of D1 guys do. Ben Askren did, and you try to make the Olympic team. Cormier did. Burroughs obviously did. Jordan Burroughs, you guys always hear that name. You try to make the Olympic team in freestyle wrestling. So Kamaru Usman did that, and at the university World Trials in 2010, he beat J.P. O'Connor, who won the D1 national tournament at 157, and he also beat John Reeder, who placed above Colby in the D1 national tournament. So Kamaru was beating D1 national champions in 2010 after just, 7 years of wrestling. So it just goes to show, like, when people talk about D1 versus D2 this week, know that Kamaru's actually beaten D1 wrestlers already. He's beaten D1 national champions, so the highest of high wrestlers. And Kamaru also tried to make the Olympic team at 84 kilograms, and he wrestled, which is about 185 pounds, and he wrestled Jake Herbert, who was a Hodge Trophy winner, which is essentially the equivalent of the Heisman in D1 wrestling. And he wrestled him, and Jake Herbert ended up making the Olympic team. And for the Olympic trials, Kamaru lost to him in a very, very close match. But that just goes to show Kamaru, in about 9 years of wrestling, I think that was in 2011, 2012 when he wrestled Herbert. And in about 9 years of wrestling, he was wrestling the best wrestler in our country who made the Olympic team and having competitive matches with him. So just know that although D1 is generally much better than D2, there are weird exceptions like Kamaru Usman, and he's still developing. So you got to realize, like, he wrestled Herbert in 2011 to 2012, and he's added probably 7 more years of just wrestling and other martial arts in his game. So I don't think, even in a pure wrestling match, that Colby necessarily beats Kamaru. Because you'll hear a lot of people kind of saying that this week, that, MMA wrestling, maybe Kamaru wins, but Colby would win in a pure wrestling match. I don't necessarily think that's true, because, Kamaru already beat some of these D1 guys, and you can look at it online. I was tweeting out some of the matches, but I generally think they're both awesome wrestlers, but I do think Kamaru's size might matter a lot in this matchup. And a thing about Kamaru, when he wrestled J.P. O'Connor, in freestyle wrestling back then, you had 3 mini matches, and they called them periods, and it was kind of 2 out of 3, and he lost the first period 3-0 to J.P. O'Connor. And just like Kamaru kind of wears on people in MMA, he kind of wore down J.P. O'Connor, and he ended up beating him 4-3 in period 2, and then he beat him 6-0 in period 3 and just dominated him in period 3. And it just goes to show that he kind of wore down J.P. O'Connor as the match went. So he's just kind of a freak wrestler, and just he's just a specimen, and he has just he's really good at using his size in his wrestling matches to kind of wear people down. So I just wanted to give you the background. Both these guys are super fucking legit wrestlers, but as far as credentials go, just because Kamaru Usman was D2, it doesn't mean that he's an inferior wrestler, even in pure wrestling, to Colby. I think both of these guys are just really, really good wrestlers. So hope that made sense. Hope you followed along, and hope that was clear. But I'm going to enjoy the fights this weekend, and comment below. Thank you.